Hey everybody, with 2024 now well underway, one of the things I decided to take a look at as I prepare for my year ahead of painting and sketching was the colors I keep in my sketch kit. I have a palette and materials that I keep packed in a bag, ready to go to grab at any moment when I want to go out urban sketching or to do a little plein air painting. And I have kept a separate palette in that kit since my very first time joining an official Urban Sketchers meetup group about a year and a half ago. And that was because I drove all the way to Boston with all of my materials, I thought, only to realize that I had not actually brought my paints. I had everything but paints. So I hopped over to the Blick store. We met up in Cambridge in Central Square. There happens to be a Blick store. And I zipped over there and I grabbed the Daniel Smith mixing set, which is a little kit that had 15 colors in it. And this was the kit I started with for my urban sketching. I already had a larger set of Daniel Smith paints at home, so I knew the colors would be familiar and the paints were what I was comfortable with. I took that kit with me on a trip that I took to Vermont last year, and that was the palette that I used. And what I discovered, the original set comes in this little plastic box. It's a grid just like this. It's about this size. I had cut this to fit. And the little half pans slotted into these individual grids. But it had almost no mixing space. It didn't have any like real mixing wells, and I didn't like the container very much, and I also felt there were some colors that I needed to add. So I went on Etsy and I bought this cute little purple container, and as you can see, it has two large mixing wells and then a kind of area I can use over here. And when this originally came, it was set to hold I think 14. Yeah, looks like it was set to hold about 14 half pans. And so I just took all the inside bits out and threw that away. Used some double stick tape and found that I could easily fit 21 colors in here, which realistically is more colors than I need. But what I have been using now for almost a year and a half was this original set of colors plus some what I call like cheater colors that I had thrown in. And when I first got the Daniel Smith mixing set, I took some time getting to know it. I made this massive color chart where I mixed all the paints to see the huge range you can get. I can see why the Daniel Smith company sells this as their ultimate mixing set because the possibilities are pretty endless, as you see here. But what I found is there were definitely colors in there that I really never used. Phthalo blue and phthalo green are very useful mixing colors for sure, but also they were taking up precious real estate and I wasn't ever using them. I also felt that at this point in time, I wanted to take out some of the opaque colors that were in the original set. So Indian red, although it's very useful, is extremely opaque and it lifts a lot, and I have a hard time with that when I'm painting on plein air. Same thing with Pyrrole Scarlet. It's not my favorite red orange and it's very opaque. It lifts heavily. So I decided to prioritize and think about what paints I want to take into 2024 and what my goals are. So what I reconfigured my whole palette, and I wound up with 21 colors. That is still probably too many colors, but I use different colors in different ways. So in this video, I thought I would walk you through swatching out my new sketch kit that I'll be using this year and tell you a little bit about why I chose the paints that I chose. So here we go. All right, so here you see I've got my grid set up, and the colors that I have decided to put into my palette this year are lemon yellow, Hansa yellow medium, Quinacridone Gold, raw Sienna Light, yellow ochre, brown ochre, Alizarin Crimson, Quinacridone Rose, Quinacridone Burnt Orange, French Ultramarine, Cerulean, Cobalt Blue, Sap Green, Serpentine Genuine, Perylene Green, Burnt Sienna, Burnt Umber, Raw Umber, Jane's Gray, Payne's Gray, and Carbazole Violet. And I know that when you look at the colors as I've swatched them out, initially you might think that I have a lot of very similar colors, which is true when you look at the raw pigment. For instance, raw Sienna Light looks very similar to yellow ochre, looks pretty similar to brown ochre. Those, when you just take them straight out of the tube, they don't look radically different. When they look radically different is when you start mixing them with other colors. So when you mix all those yellows with the various blues I have, you get distinctly different grays and greens. That's why these colors are so exciting. That's why I've chosen them. And that's also why I need to make this giant swatch chart, because I need to know how all of my pigments are going to interact. Almost all the paints I'm using here are Daniel Smith paints. The only exceptions are the cerulean I'm using is Winsor & Newton, because I think it re-wets more nicely than Daniel Smith. The cobalt blue is an M gram color, because that is what my local art supply store had. I do really like it, but it stays very, very liquid. It takes a long time to set in my half pans. And the only other color on here that is not Daniel Smith is the Payne's Gray that I have happens to be Winsor & Newton, which is honestly not my preference. It's much more blue than the Daniel Smith Payne's Gray. The Daniel Smith version is kind of darker and a little less saturated, I guess. But this is what I had. Other colors worth noting on my palette. As I mentioned before, I tried to move away from some of the opaque colors. In general, yellows, lemon yellow, Hansa yellow medium, do tend to become a little bit opaque, but that's true of most yellows, so I couldn't really get away from that. But I let the lemon yellow replace buff titanium. So that is in the Daniel Smith mixing set. It's a very opaque color. And while I do have uses for it, especially when I'm painting a little more abstractly, I felt like it wasn't the best use of my precious palette space. The other color on here that's fairly opaque is Sap Green. Sap Green can run pretty opaque, but I decided it was worth keeping. Even though I have blues and yellows, and I could mix all my own greens and never use green out of a tube, sometimes when you are urban sketching or painting on plein air, you don't have a lot of time. So I think having some convenience colors is really useful for speed, right? If I had all the time in the world always, I could just work with my 3 primaries and mix everything, and that would be great. But I think having a few shortcut colors to help you be able to work efficiently on plein air makes sense. That is also why I keep Jane's Gray and Payne's Gray on my palette, because they are great cheater colors that help me get darks really quickly. Here you see I have swatched everything out, and I am really excited to take this palette into 2024. I'm particularly excited for the addition of Carbazole Violet, which I did not have on my sketch palette previously. But one of the things I had the hardest time with last year was shadows on yellow. So if I had a yellow object and I needed a shadow on that object, I really struggled to get a good shadow color that didn't go like green or really ugly gray. And I can see in my mixing chart that Carbazole Violet is going to be a super helpful shadow maker, and I'm very excited. So what are the colors you keep on your palette? Go ahead and tell me down in the comments, and happy sketching in 2024.